The architect is Robert Venturi. And here he's looking young. He's now 90 and not too well. But he sees himself as a young rebel. It's kind of the image he has to this day. We'll look at a series of issues, but let's start with born 1925 in Philadelphia to an Italian family. His father died when he was in college, and he took over the family business, which was wholesale Italian meat for delis, and ran that business while he was starting his office. So just to encourage you guys, the first thing we learn about architecture is you can't make a living as an architect. So you got to figure out what you're going to do on the side. Name an architect, I'll tell you the name of the rich woman that he married. Like Bob Stern married a Gimbel. Gimbel used to be a rival of Macy's as a large department store. You go down the list. One way to start a career is through entering competitions, and that's expensive. You've got models, and you've got to pay employees to get the work done, and so it helps to have some resources, and he did because he was running the family business. He attended Princeton, and this is at a time when most of the architects his age, just a little bit older, were going to Harvard, where they were studying with Walter Gropius. What's Walter Gropius famous for? Correct. Gropius founded the Bauhaus, which is a pioneer of, very orthodox functionalist modern architecture. And then when the Nazis took over Germany, Gropius went to England and then came to the United States and became chair of Department of Architecture at Harvard. And many of the architects who were dominant figures in the 1960s studied with Gropius at Harvard, so they had this modern architectural background. Venturi was exceptional. He studied at Princeton and with someone named Jean Labitude, and who was a Beaux-Arts architect. So we've got a different background. He went to work briefly for Louis Kahn. It helps kick off your career that Kahn said at one point, Venturi is the most important young architect in Philadelphia. So that helps. Helps get attention. And he taught at the University of Pennsylvania, where Kahn taught, and was part of what's called the Philadelphia School. And we'll talk a bit about that. The Philadelphia School is identified with Kahn, and mostly Kahn, somewhat Venturi, but there were quite a few architects that worked in this kind of sensitivity to context, a background architecture, typically a use of masonry. So there's a whole point of view of this Philadelphia School. You'll find a link to a book on the Philadelphia School at my website, and it's in our course outline that I wrote. It's not published. So then in 66, he publishes Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which is regarded as antagonistic to modern architecture. So Venturi is referred to as the father of postmodern architecture. And again, that doesn't mean a lot to us today anymore. And Venturi considered it a misnomer. He considered himself a modern architect, but postmodernism is a rejection of the functionalist orthodoxies of the modern architecture of the international style that grows out of Mies, Corbu, Gropius, etc. But he insists that he's continuing the true program of modern architecture. And we associate Mies van der Rohe with the phrase, less is more. So Mies wants to make his building as simple as possible, and Venturi responds, less is a bore. So he would say that in oversimplifying his architecture, Mies falsifies it. So if you have a modern, has anybody ever walked into the lobby of the Seagram Building, 53rd and Park? Good. Well, you guys, make sure you do. So if you're in Midtown Manhattan, just walk in there. Here's, one of the, it's something you should see, like you should see the Guggenheim. It's one of the icons of modern architecture. It's, pardon?
The bar is cool too.
Yeah, and that's gonna change. You mean the Four Seasons restaurant bar?
Yeah.
Oh, that's it used to be the Brasserie. I'm not sure what it's called now.
I think it's still called that, but they just renovated it.
Yeah, it's totally different. When I was young, that was the place that was open 24/7. So 2 o'clock in the morning, he said, well, where are we going to get a hamburger? Oh, we'll go to the Brasserie. So I went there. Oh my God, it's closed. What's that?
I think VSR renovated it.
Aha. So Venturi says, okay, you're on your way to work, right? Maybe you're an ad exec working in the Seagram Building. You get out of the subway, you get out of the taxi, you're, hurrying into the lobby on the way to your office. What do you want to grab on your way in? Coffee and a newspaper. Where's the newsstand? Well, there is one, but it's like hidden. So Venturi says, our buildings have to be able to withstand the cigarette machine in the lobby. So, we don't have cigarette machines anymore, but what he meant is, on your way in, you want to grab a coffee. You want to grab a newspaper. You want to grab a pack of cigarettes in the old days when you could smoke in the office, which you can't do anymore. So that's part of the function of the building. And if you make a building that, looks beautiful, when Venturi was a young man teaching at University of Pennsylvania, there was a young woman there named Denise Scott Brown. So Denise Scott Brown was an architect from Rhodesia and South Africa. And she was quite young, had studied also, was married to a guy named Scott Brown. And they got married in Rhodesia or South Africa, and then went off to England and studied just at a time when the English were beginning to challenge orthodox modern architecture. And then they heard the person to study with was Kahn. So they went to the University of Pennsylvania. He died in an automobile accident. So here she is, a young widow, and scared to death, and teaching a section, and one of her students is me. And she's still bugged by giving her a hard time. And it's like 60 years later or something like that. But anyway, so she, we get along fine, but she has fond memories of my being a bit disruptive in class. So they got married, and now they both taught at Penn, and Venturi taught a design studio, which I never took. I took other design studios, but not his. And he taught a theory course, which I did take because it was required for everybody. And then he did the lecture, she did the section. It was actually 2 different courses, but technically she was doing the sections for his theory course. And they get married, and they had very parallel interests, and they really fed each other, supported each other, helped each other develop their ideas. Although she was more interested in popular culture and American cities. She went off and spent a year in Los Angeles, and then he felt ill-treated at University of Pennsylvania. He was a Mannerist architecture. Okay, who can tell me what Mannerism is? What's Mannerism? So we go early Renaissance, high Renaissance, Mannerism, Baroque. Breaking the rules and playing games with the rules. So, oh, columns are supposed to be this. Well, suppose I use columns in another way to play games with them. So that would be Mannerism. So Venturi is a modern Mannerist. He's Mannerist. He's in the Mannerist stage of modern architecture, whereas Mannerism with a capital M is the game-playing stage with Renaissance architecture. So he was kind of felt picked on at Penn. He's a little oversensitive, but now Penn was very civil. No faculty member ever criticized another faculty member, but they might attack their students' work on a jury. And so Venturi felt picked on that way. So they left Penn, taught for a year at Yale, and they took the Yale studio to Las Vegas and produced a book called Learning from Las Vegas. And then he didn't teach anymore. He didn't like teaching, he liked being an architect. So where Kahn was both a teacher and a practicing architect, Venturi was only briefly a teacher and then became a practicing architect. Now we associate Venturi with something we call the failure of modern architecture. And you can argue whether or not modern architecture failed, but when we get to what had been exciting in the 1950s, these glass boxes. Well, look at all the glass and the transparency and the clean lines and getting away from all the doodad details and the boldness of it, and it's responsive to the modern corporation and the modern world. And then these things start to march through New York. And then they start to march around the world. And people start to become unhappy with them on very theoretical levels, and then also on the just very practical. This is ugly. What is this? And we don't feel that way anymore, because now, what are these likely to look like? Right? You look at the new glass buildings going up in New York, and we've got Frank Gehry's apartment building at the Brooklyn Bridge with all that curves in it. We have a Frank Gehry building on 18th Street and the West Side Highway, which is like crystal. We have a huge apartment building going up around, 50th or 60th Street on the West Side Highway, and it's like this big diagonals. So we don't make these boxes anymore. We do actually make things that are quite responsive, and maybe Venturi plays a role in saying, hey guys, but he wasn't the only one. So, a very important journalist and historian is Peter Blake, and he wrote a book about the important modern architects, with a chapter on Mies, on Gropius, and Corbu. And he gets caught up in this spirit. Venturi was the first, but everybody starts to pile on. So Peter Blake's book is called Form Follows, Not Function, but Fiasco. Why modern architecture hasn't worked. So everybody's now attacking this. And then on an urban level, what's it like to live in these things? Well, one of the big accomplishments of modern architecture is the projects. Housing projects in cities all over the United States and all over the world. And in a book that comes out in the early 60s, The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, died recently, looks at, it doesn't care about the aesthetic, but this is killing the street, and it's, people can't form social groups, and it's very disruptive to people's lives and to the life of the city. And one of the many other books, there was Brent Brolin, The Failure of Modern Architecture. So there are many books along these lines. And let's just see how we're doing, if we're getting anywhere with the internet. So here's the lobby of the Seagram building. I don't see a Starbucks. I mean, it looks like an Egyptian tomb. This very stark, very beautiful, huge sheets of bronze-tinted glass, generous high ceilings, and then these elevator banks sheathed in marble. But is this supposed to be an abstract monument, or is this a place where people are working? They got to buy a newspaper. They got to buy a cup of coffee. So this is part of the attack on this stark modern architecture. People said, one building by Mies is great. When you start getting block after block of this stuff, it's getting kind of rough. So, kind of facetiously, the end of modern architecture is actually dated. So, a huge housing project. I think it's St. Louis. And here it is. I mean, just block after block after, there aren't even any blocks. Building after building. They just go on and on and on. And this was touted, this was the ultimate housing project. It does everything Corbu wanted. It has sidewalks and streets in the sky. It has communal laundry rooms. It's got all the, everything is going to be the greatest. And 20 years later, what'd they have to do? They dynamited the whole thing. And they had to take the whole thing to end. So there's a book called Language of Postmodern Architecture, is one of the books on the failure of modern architecture, takes the date, it says the date and the exact minute of the end of modern architecture we know, because it's when they hit the plunger to dynamite Pruitt-Igoe. And New York did a pretty good job with its public housing. I mean, we're not delighted about it, but they work. But other, like Philadelphia has dynamited almost all of its public housing, including a project by Louis Kahn. So we're in the time of this criticism, unhappiness with modern architecture. And Venturi is absolutely in the forefront of that. So his book is Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, a response to modern architecture which is simple and direct. In the very opening paragraph of his book, Venturi says, why complexity and contradiction in architecture? I mean, I'm a young architect, I want to launch myself, I want to be controversial. Suppose I say, all buildings should be purple. And I might get a write-up. But that's stupid and arbitrary. Complexity and contradiction, Venturi says, is actually philosophically fundamental. Why? Why should architecture be complex and contradictory as opposed to purple? Because life is. Because reality is. When have you ever run into anything that was clear and simple? Life is not clear and simple. The world is not clear and simple. Reality is not clear and simple. It is life, reality, and the world are complex and contradictory. Shouldn't our architecture be reflective of the world in which we live and accommodating of it? If we've got a wall that has to do a double job, be a wall for this room and a wall for the street, it's got a complex and contradictory job. Our architecture should engage and be responsive to that. So we'll go into Venturi's work in some detail, but let's just zip through some key projects. And, okay, so you're a young architect. You are teaching. What's the first job you're likely to get? How about renovating a coffee shop on campus? And in fact, one of our former deans renovated Mike's. You know, that's the jobs you get. You know, so the guy who has the coffee shop across the street from the architecture school says, you know, I needed this place renovated. So some architect on the faculty maybe could do it. And this is absolutely revolutionary. He gets this stupid, simple commission. But look what he does with it. First of all, he puts up a sign. Grants. Now, everybody says, you can't have a sign on your architecture. What's a response to somebody saying you can't put a sign on your architecture? What's that? So this is one of the three most important icons of modernism, and it's got a sign on it. What are you telling me I can't put a sign on my building because it's against the modern Orthodox rules? You can't get more Orthodox than Gropius's Bauhaus. That's the modern building. It's got a sign on it. So Venturi, all the weird stuff he does, he can totally justify it. He knows history better than his critics do. And then, just to rub it in, he puts a coffee cup on there. You can't do that. And then the interior gets even better. So next week we'll be going into that. Now, what's the other commission you get as a young architect just getting started? Some families, some sucker in your family needs a new house and you get the job. So he does a house for his mother. So this is the kind of work that you get as a young architect. So here's a little house for his mother in, still technically in the city of Philadelphia, but out in a nice suburban area. And here's Venturi's mother. And there's a whole philosophical thesis here, which we'll again go into. But there's a whole discourse on what modern architecture, well, an attack on what modern architects have been doing. They were not doing this. They were doing. So these are houses by Walter Gropius. It's supposed to be white. It's supposed to be a box. It's supposed to have a flat roof. And Gropius was doing these houses in Massachusetts, where he was teaching at Harvard. And then his young associate, who was the leading critic, design critic at Harvard, Marcel Breuer, also from the Bauhaus, doing boxes. Now, they're doing them in field stone, they're doing them with wood, because we're in New England. But they're still boxes with flat roofs. And right in the middle of when they're doing those, Venturi comes along and does this, which is sort of reminiscent of a suburban house. So we'll look at all the elements of this next week and how they are bringing back into architecture elements of everyday life that have been abandoned by other architects. So we see here, manner is complexity and contradiction. What is this? It's just a half round nailed to the wall. It's applied ornament. You're not supposed to do that. It's almost ordinary. It's ordinary but slightly weird. And then it's going to have historical, locational, and psychological references, and we'll see those next week. Then he gets a fire station. Let me just check something here. How do you know this is a fire station? Well, we know it's a civic building because it's got a flag in front of it. And he makes glass garage doors here so you can see the fire truck. And just in case you still haven't figured it out, it says fire station right here. Now, anybody know why this is white from here to here? And then it's red. There's a principle called 1% for art. And that means when you do a public building, and this doesn't happen as much as it should, but 1% of the budget should go for art. So maybe you put a sculpture in front, because it's a civic public building. You can also use that 1% to make better quality details in the building. So he takes the 1% and he spends it on glazed white brick, but then the budget runs out. It picks up with the red brick. So, key element in Venturi's work is humor. And then, fire station. What are the parts of a fire station? Number one, the fire trucks. Here they are. Number two, when you come home from the fire, you hang the hose. The sections of canvas hose are hung here so they can drip dry. The tower. Number three, the firemen live here and then go rushing off when there's an alarm. But when they're not, they hang out here. They live here. So, where do these elements come from? How do we know they're living there? They come from Venturi's mother's house, so that we know it's a house. It's called humor. And then finally, he's done a lot of buildings. We won't look at all of them. And some of the buildings are just things the office does. They're not necessarily making a didactic statement. But there's the National Gallery. Let me see what I got here. The National Gallery in London. And it's a neoclassical building. And it was in need of an extension. And they had gone through several modern architects who made glass boxes, proposed glass boxes, and they kept getting turned down. It was just not right. And so finally they said, you know what, we're going to make a building that's stylistically sympathetic with the existing building. And they had an invited competition, and Sterling and Venturi were two of the invitees, and Venturi won the competition. And so we pick up the cornice. We use engaged columns that are like reminiscent of the columns here. But this is not a neoclassical building. A neoclassical building does not have an entrance like this. This is a modern building. So, very interesting play of neoclassical and modern elements against each other. So, Venturi has also been polemical, spreading his ideas in books. First one is Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. He wrote that himself. And it was absolutely revolutionary and drew great attention to him. Then, along with Denise Scott Brown and one of my classmates who worked until he died a couple of years ago for Venturi, Steve Eisenhower, the three of them did Learning from Las Vegas. Key thing is it's not imitating Las Vegas. It's learning from principles from Las Vegas. And a whole bunch of more books. And then the key ideas of Venturi's complexity and contradiction. So here is this house, which is too big and too small. This is a window, but it's too big to be a window. Is this doors or a window? Here's the stair. You come up the stairs and thud, you bump into the wall. So you have to go around. You come up the stairs, thud. So you have to go around. So there are all kinds of games going on here. I won't do much analysis of the plan. I'm more interested in the facade. But there's a lot going on in the plan. And if you choose this building for your project, you might want to look into that. Respect for the past. So here is Frank Lloyd Wright's House for Himself, which is derivative of the Chandler House by Bruce Price. And Venturi is putting himself in this tradition rather than in the Walter Gropius white box tradition. Playing with pop culture. This is his project for World's Fair in Philadelphia. Did not get built. And he's playing with signs, neon, etc. The Almost Ordinary. This is two brick and Wisłowski houses in Nantucket, Massachusetts. Now, just to tell a story on myself, he did two houses. Oh, let's stop and say, this is what Nantucket houses look like. Except he's got all these games going on here, which we'll talk about. But he doesn't do a glass box in a traditional New England fishing environment. And he did two houses in Block Island, Rhode Island, which a friend of mine had a house there, invited me and my wife there. And we're walking along, she says, see all those houses up on the cliff? One of them is Venturi. Which one? I didn't get it right. It's so much, as soon as it was pointed out, oh, of course. But, it really blends in. So respect for context. The almost ordinary. Signs. And so he celebrates the signs we see in Las Vegas. All these signs are gone. We're in a new generation of Las Vegas. But in '68, when he wrote that book, this is what Las Vegas looked like. The Duck in the Decorated Shed, we'll explore what that's about. And Venturi is for the decorated shed and against the duck. Humor, like our bumping into the wall here. Mannerism, so here is the Low House, famous shingle style house, no longer with us, by McKinley and White. And here is Project for a Beach House by Venturi, not built, 1959, that takes this and then makes it extremely complicated. Chimney, but then, it has this big element on it. Everything is distorted, playing games with it. So he's a mannerist architect.